Alrighty, thanks for the opportunity. Really appreciate being able to speak here, and even more so, really appreciate a lot of the talks that I've seen and the hallway conversations. I'm at O'Reilly. It's actually fairly recent that I've joined O'Reilly, but just as far as background, I've spent about 10 years leading data teams, doing mostly machine learning at scale across a few different verticals, and I've spent the past 3-4 years evangelizing open source projects, working on Cascading, Mesos, and more recently Spark. And in particular, out of those, I've had a lot of opportunities to be teaching tutorials and working in universities, teaching in various programs regarding data science and big data. With Spark in particular, we had this huge adoption rate, and we've been doing very large tutorials all around the world. And I was leading a team that included a couple people, a couple of professors from UC, Anthony Joseph and Amit Talwalkar, who just did the 2 Spark MOOCs on edX. So we definitely saw a number of different kinds of use cases of both in-class and remote learning, and in a lot of cases trying to leverage IPython notebooks or something close. So I wanted to present about where we're going at O'Reilly now with the new O'Reilly Learning team, which is very much using Jupyter, but also looking at how do we bring in other types of media channels, other kinds of learning modes, and how do we integrate this in our context as a publisher. So who we are, O'Reilly Learning is a new business unit, and we're not these people as far as O'Reilly, but we are these people. So we have a lot of books, a lot of videos, a lot of conferences, a lot of involvement with developer communities over the years. And O'Reilly is closely associated with open source. We started OSCON. I just got out of OSCON coming up here. The objective that I was given from the higher-ups as I walked my way into the door was, as a verbatim, examine, make sense of, and organize our various training products and learning channels for ourselves and our customers. And speaking as an author, I've been a writer for O'Reilly for, I guess, the last 11 or 12 years. It is kind of daunting because there's 5 different video channels and there's I don't know how many different training channels, all these business units that have been acquired over the years. Trying to understand that from an author's perspective is daunting. Our editors, I think, are probably even more confused. But we're trying to make this something that's a very cohesive whole. How do we bring these different types of learning experiences together into something that's more effective? So one of the first things I've done is to try to figure out, just with O'Reilly as a case study, what do we have and how does it work? And if I were to try to put together an overly simplified map of where the flows are, I'm really interested in charting from an audience perspective, always audience first, but then closely behind that from the author's perspective. The authors coming in, what is their workflow like? What's the experience that they have? And where are the routes, the different touch points for different types of media for learning products? As you can see, there's several here. I've kind of collapsed a few, but it really spans a range up at the top between in-person events, which often have a very high transaction cost. People will spend thousands of dollars, or their employers will spend thousands of dollars and maybe a week out of work to go to some kind of conference. That ranges from a high transaction cost to a relatively low transaction cost for on-demand behind a paywall with something like Safari Books online. And this process that we have here is, I feel, overly complex. It's still regarded as being relatively agile. I don't know if that's really the right word. I don't like to use that word too much. I used to be an engineering director, and anyway. I've written for a variety of different publishers, and the workflow that we have here, we can put out a book in like 6 months. generally somewhere there, 6 to 9 months. Whereas in a lot of organizations, that workflow is more like 2 years in some cases. In our case, typically you're working with one editor, whereas in other places you might be working with 12 different editors, and there's handoffs all the way across. So the publishing process is really complex, and that's if you're doing a book. If you're doing a book and you're doing a Kindle and you're doing some video to go along with it and you're going out and doing appearances, it gets oh so complex. And the crux of what I think is a lot of the problem right now is that when we look to publish things, we generally reduce them down to EPUBs of one form or another. And there's probably some video content that goes in there or can be linked there, but it's a combination of these two that are basically our source repository, our content source. And the standards for EPUBs are, they don't accommodate exactly what I'd like to do in teaching people programming, for instance, how to use code. So we're looking at how to re-architect this. Here's an article that came out last year. Been in some conversation with the person, but it's called Learning Architecture. It's actually behind a paywall from Deloitte, but there are some pretty good reviews of this online, publicly available. The idea of learning architecture, though, is I think something that's being formulated. In the words of Michael Pollan, you are where you eat eats. And I always try to keep that in mind in terms of how do we provide things for the audience. We have customers, we have audience, people who buy books and videos. We also have customers in terms of companies that are sponsoring conferences, and they'll, in some cases, sponsor books. But they in turn have customers that they're accountable to, that they're trying to accomplish something with. So I like to think of that whole chain of learning. So we live within a community of makers and innovators, learners, implementers. The objective that my team has is to come up with a learning architecture that's very effective internally, but then to externalize this for our customers and then apply that as a kind of design pattern for them to use for their customers. So as far as background, I'd like to point to an article or presentation from the Open Data Science Conference in Boston recently. Kyle Kelly, who's here, and Andrew Ottawan, who's the CTO of O'Reilly. I've worked with them both in this project over the past year or so, but they had a great presentation called On-Demand Analytic and Learning Environments with Jupyter. And in this, they explored a couple of themes. One is the notion of computational narratives that they were describing, of where we can leverage code in the context of media and learning experience. And speaking from the perspective of being an O'Reilly author before, we always try to put the code first. That's what you're taught by your editor, is that when you start out the first paragraph of the first chapter, show some code, get people to dive into it, start to feel comfortable, and then back off from there and start to explain what's going on in the code. So we like the idea of integrating code as media into the narrative. And there's a lot of reasons for using these narratives. Sometimes they're books. Sometimes they're actually being used to surface insights. There's some type of notebook that's showing leaderboards or other structure of a community. They may be a white paper or a sponsored paper. They may be an executive dashboard. So we see a number of different types of consumers of this. My experience on this started a couple years ago when we were, in 2013, we pitched doing a new type of book called Just Enough Math. And the thesis there was teaching advanced math to business executives. In particular, so that people in business would understand sort of the why and how of leveraging more advanced techniques in data science, essentially to fund big data projects. And we find that there's a very big demand for people who haven't taken 3 years of calculus, but still want to understand, what is it about graph algorithms? What is it about matrix factorization? How is this going to affect how I have to manage supply chain in a billion-dollar business unit? And the way that we approached this was to use IPython Notebook for the examples and take code showing the math, but then tying it very directly to a use case that would be familiar, starting from use case first in the presentation and contextualizing the problem so that they don't have to have 3 years of calculus before they actually see a use case. And while we were doing that, we did run into very interesting things while we were going out to conferences and doing tutorials. A lot of it was more on the operations side, but we had a lot of learnings. And I got to work with Kyle Kelly and Andrew Ottawan on this. One of the big learnings was this. I taught at Stanford years and years and years ago, and I've taught since at other schools. But for a lot of my career, I'd been a software engineer or engineering manager, and then going into leading data teams and doing more of the data scientist role. I found myself in the role of being an author and teacher with this tool chain that depended on authors using Git and Docker and IPython Notebook and software engineering practices that authors typically don't touch. So it was very interesting to go back and forth, and a lot of that dialogue with Kyle and Andrew is we're trying to use that to redefine our workflow for authors. One of the things we were doing was to be alpha testers for this. If you haven't seen it, I think it's very compelling. Nature magazine used TempNB and IPython Notebook, essentially the same tech stack, the same code base. They have an article here where they're taking their peer-reviewed articles and they can ship them out. Here's the data, here's the code, here's the article. If you want to run this, feel free. And the infrastructure will support 10,000 plus people online at a time running their own container. It leads to repeatable science. It really is, in my opinion, a lot of the essence of science. And Jupyter, combined with Docker and a few other things in the tech stack, are allowing that kind of open science, repeatable science. There was also an article, sort of our thesis statement from O'Reilly. It's by Andrew Ottawan that came out in May, talking more about our internal platform that now we're starting to expose. And Tim O'Reilly made some notes about that here. It basically looks like this. It's called Atlas, and it's where authors can go in and put in HTML or Markdown or ASCII doc or other types of content, now also Jupyter notebooks. We can bring in a bunch of different content, organize it as chapters and sections, etc. And it's a very collaborative environment, kind of like Google Docs, you could think of. So editors are in there, changing things or making comments of what needs to be changed. And then it's all backed by Git. So the authors can also be putting in content via pushing in Git. And Git is already kind of getting out of the comfort zone for a lot of authors. There's a lot of learning that has to happen. But when we start to combine Jupyter, Git, Docker, Thieve, and other open source projects along with it, it becomes a pretty interesting tech stack, but it's also a fairly unforeign grounds for writers. I mentioned this already, but there's something called Thieve, and this is an open source project. It's on GitHub. The idea is to be able to have essentially Jupyter cells as a service. There's a way you could take parts of a notebook and publish them as HTML, as a web page. So I like to think of it almost like a three-tier model. It's almost like saying middleware, where the notebooks are the middleware, but what gets provided by Thieve is actually HTML that's for the presentation. And in this way, you can do things that you want to. And that you need to, in terms of branding, for instance, is very strong in publishing. Sometimes what we're publishing is for another entity, and they need to have their logo. They need to have their marketing funnel tied into it. And also, it's a little bit better in terms of instrumentation and some of the operational aspects of it. Thieve is a moon of Jupyter, by the way. And so our proof of concept then is called beta. And if you go to beta.o'reilly.com /learning in particular, we've got some good examples. Some of these actually did not start out as articles. They started out as IPython notebooks. And so, for instance, here's one. Jake just had an excellent talk. And let me bring up one recent article. So this was actually from earlier this month. Jake had an article about pivot tables in Python. And here, if you go in, you can run it. And you can see it's got a kind of a different skin. It's got a very different sort of branding and look and feel. But these are notebooks. And you could have interactive graphics with controls, etc. again, we're just kind of blurring the lines between what would be classically our content platform and Project Jupyter. Okay. Now, as far as the tech stack, there's the authoring process where you're iterating with co-authors, bringing in content from different sources, working with the editors, etc. Then there's the production process where you go through QC and get everything ready to do prepress, or in this case, get it packaged as a Jupyter Notebook in a Docker container, and then we can use Theeb to surface that out to the web pages. Of course, there's some type of cloud infrastructure underneath this, typically. So the question, though, is really what's the difference between how authors currently create materials and this new world where they're using Jupyter, Docker, Theeb, Get, various types of clouds to support it, et cetera. Okay. So for some examples, I wanted to part of the talk was to try to point out some good examples of using notebooks in education, and also some other examples beyond Jupyter to try and compare and contrast. I was really excited to see what's going on with Microsoft in terms of Cortana's use of Jupyter. I had been working at Databricks prior to O'Reilly, and we're doing a lot of work, of course, with notebooks there, very much in a similar kind of effort. Also, if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend something called Code Neuro. This is led by Jeremy Freeman out of Howard Hughes Medical Institute, Genelia Farm, and this is a really good one. They have basically a hackathon for some of the world's top neuroscientists. They get together for a weekend twice a year, and they are working with Jupyter on top of Spark primarily, but then also using D3 and things like that. Matt Conlon is from New York Data Company. He's worked on Lightning and Thunder along with Spark as a visualization layer, really high performance data visualization layer that leverages D3 and Node.js, et cetera. See, what they're doing is they have these intense microscopes, and they're looking at huge networks of neurons firing in real time off of rats using lasers. So they don't hurt the rats per se, but they're able to get real-time feeds and process them and redirect what they're doing with the microscopes. So it's actually one of the larger use cases or larger data rate use cases for Spark streaming, for instance, but also for data visualization. Again, the way that they are sharing science is based off of Jupyter. Another good example, one of the other people involved with this conference is Olga Bavatnik at UCSD, and they have a project there called Yale Lab. And again, their bioinformatics is being formulated around using an IPython notebook workflow. Very, very similar idea. Lorena's over there. Definitely looking forward to her keynote tomorrow, and I think that out of some of the, I want to put together a list of examples, and so I wanted to highlight some that are my favorites. If you haven't seen these, I think there's definitely some great examples throughout the web. There's also a shared doc that we have. We're collecting, where we're seeing Jupyter Hub being used in academia. Also, just different use cases for Jupyter in education, and also in industry too. Taking a look at some of the companies that are being really innovative about this. And so I'll leave links about that up there. I've been working with Fernando and others on this, or just trying to curate it, let's say. Now, in terms of compare contrast with other types of notebooks, definitely give a lot of credit to R Markdown. I worked for Databricks, and I'll show you an example here if you haven't seen. So Databricks is where you have notebooks that actually maintain the state of the analytics you're working on, and then the clusters, the Spark clusters, they're in the cloud, but the clusters can be attached or detached within seconds. And it's quite different than usual practice. At one point, I led a team that had the largest Hadoop instance in EC2, and I worked very closely with Amazon on the lead up to Elastic MapReduce. And the problem that you see using cluster computing in the cloud is that if you have to launch hundreds of nodes on VMs, it could take you hours just to get the cluster up and running. So by leveraging Linux containers, C groups, you can instead bring that time down to seconds. And it might be that part of your analytics workflow requires a huge cluster for 5 minutes. And then the rest of your workflow, you need 1 or 2 nodes just to be able to do some visualization or some queries. And we see that across the industry. It's a very typical pattern. So Databricks is trying to leverage that. It's not Jupyter. It's their own code base. But I used this for about a better part of a year, teaching in conferences, teaching at universities, also in private corporate training, teaching people to think of applications by using notebooks and then having them backed by cluster computing in the cloud. Here's one where we take a look at meetups for Spark and pull down the data so that we can put together leaderboards of who's doing what meetups where, who's sponsoring them, what the topics are, just trying to get some analysis of really what does that community look like. So I'll leave that up. Another one I'd point to, if you haven't seen, is Andy Petrella. And it's called Spark Notebook. And it's not Jupyter, although it does use some of the protocol. There's definitely some commonality there. I've done some teaching in Amsterdam with Andy, and this is all Scala-based. But it's very interesting. He's iterating on this very rapidly. He's done very nice integration with Docker, with Mesos, very nice integration of visualization packages. Definitely one to track. And a couple others as well. I know that Toby was around here earlier. I don't know if he's here now, but a friend of mine who was at IBM formerly was sharing with me about IBM Knowledge Anyhow, which is using IPython Notebook hosted in the cloud, SoftLayer by IBM. And of course, Mathematica is a great example of, they've been doing this for a long time. Mathematica notebooks have been out there commercially. Let's see how we're doing for time. There's a few things that are on my wish list for what I would really like to see with notebooks. And I hope to be able to help. I hope that our team is able to help bring some of this about. But for us, in terms of publishing, video is really important. If you look at the demographics, over a certain age, most people don't want to buy books anymore, they buy Kindle. And if you look under that age, they don't buy books anymore, they watch videos. I have 2 daughters who are 11 and 10, and they go and watch YouTube for anything they need to learn. I caught them watching, they were trying to modify Minecraft, so they needed to learn how to redo the manifests on jar files. And they watched hours and hours, if not days, of how to redo jar files. And I told them, look, I can just give you a build script. But they're like, no, Dad, get out of here. So, kids love video, and we have to take that into account. And meanwhile, we have a lot of conferences all over the world. We have this huge amount of video content. If it could just be structured and tied together with other types of learning materials. There's also the social context of mentoring and bringing in experts on a problem for some period of time. There's the notion of learning paths. How can a subject matter expert structure a program of learning? And of course, I'll use the M word. There are the remote learning environments. So that leads me to MOOCs, and we just had a very interesting experience with about 100,000 people signing up for a couple of MOOCs that we did. Or I was tangentially involved, let's say. The UC professors really did the work. Hanging around folks who study MOOCs, there are some difficulties. I think that they're excellent for learning at scale, but they do have some drawbacks. Number one, it's really costly for authors to go and create a MOOC. It's also very difficult to instrument. And a lot of this, especially in industry, they want to see some sort of performance. What are we getting out of this? What's the engagement? And with edX, you're just behind a wall. You can't really instrument it all that well. There's very low completion rates, typically. TypeSafe is a counterexample. I understand they have like about a 10% completion rate, which is actually fairly rare. And the other thing is that the social context. If you're trying to teach thousands of people at a time, even if you're trying to teach hundreds of people at a time, let me draw that back because I've done that a lot. You need to have TAs. You need to have somebody to help engage in the dialogue. You can't just have one speaker and thousands of people. If you're trying to do a large MOOC, you end up having to try to arrange a small army of TAs, and that's complex in itself. So, there was a Future Learning Summit at Stanford recently, and I thought it was hilarious. I'll paraphrase Peter Norvig here, but he got up and said that MOOCs were having huge troubles because of the search engines, and we were like, "Wait a minute, aren't you from a search engine company?" But it was a really good point that you need to get people to want to interact with the learning materials, and generally that's because of social context. So I'm not sure that I really believe that a MOOC alone is going to be the path forward for learning, unless it has better social context. I could talk more about rubric, particularly ways to leverage social context, but maybe that's for another time. That's a favorite topic. Now, if you haven't seen it, this is a really great example. Yasser Abu Mustafa out of Caltech does a machine learning program there. It's not edX. They did, I believe, 1 year in edX, but they had been doing something prior to that, which is arguably more advanced, and really leveraging the notion of inverted classroom, or you might hear it called flipped classroom, where the students have a lot of materials in advance they can work through, and then essentially they're trying to build a funnel where the instructor really has the engagement at points where it's very critical and can have a lot of outcome, a lot of benefit. And it is very much kind of the opposite of what you think of when you're building a lesson plan for a classroom of 30 people. There are other issues, other pedagogical issues in terms of trying to match the content to the learner's needs. And Andrew had a nice paper about this, actually a lot of interactive examples. It's called Patterns of Code as Media. And as far as like learning to program, I think there's some great examples there that go across a spectrum. Where is the person on learning curve? Where are they in terms of being an adopter? How well do they know the material? Not just did they pass the 10 questions on the pre-exam. So looking at it in terms of more dimensions is really crucial. And so, for that, what our team is looking at is really an exercise in high dimensional data. Taking a look at the spectrum across a number of different dimensions of how do people engage with content and what do they need and why are they doing this. Not just throwing an exam at them, but trying to understand where are they at with respect to the topics. And therefore, what experience do they have? To that note, I think that there are some very good ways to use machine learning for this, if you have the right instrumentation. If you haven't seen, there's great work out of Stanford, Yuri Leskavec out of MMDS, et cetera. But more to the point, one of his postdocs, Julian Macaulay, was there. And Julian's from Australia, and when he got to grad school in the US, he believed that the beer was horrible compared to Australian beer. So he started doing machine learning work to try to understand why. And they came out with some interesting results. It dovetailed with other work that Yuri was doing. But basically what they said was, with a few different signals and not that much data, but with the right data, you can actually measure the distance between a person coming into a community and starting to learn about it. And you can actually get a pretty early trajectory of whether or not they'll stick around. Just even looking at the language they use and the difference in the language usage patterns as the person learns and as the community evolves. And you can start to detect with actually very good reliability when the person is ready to leave, in relatively far advance of them actually leaving. And if you've been involved in online forums, you've all seen this. We've all seen this. But they came up with recommender systems, time-based recommender systems to actually quantify this and measure distances of a learner with a community where they're both evolving. And I think this is fascinating, and I'm trying to put this in practice, again, in terms of open source communities, et cetera. I also want to make the point that learning curves are forever. It's sort of a Sisyphus kind of example. The idea is, particularly in data science, my experience leading data science teams is that learning curve is the hard problem. And the thing about data science is you're breaking down silos. You're transgressing and crossing boundaries that if you did not get the data across those boundaries, you would never get the insights. That's the big difference between the prior generation of business intelligence and what some of the success stories in data science have proved. But you're always having to learn about these different domains, these different processes, all these different tools. And actually budgeting for that is really one of the hardest things of being a manager in data science. But perpetual learning curve is the problem. The way to address that is to borrow from engineering, software engineering notions of, say, continuous integration or continuous deployment, and think about continuous learning. There's a great brief article by Whitney Johnson, also building on Juan Mendez, of looking at learning curve not just as the traditional sigmoid transfer curve, but actually looking at it as a continuum. For a continuous process and being able to measure and quantify when is it that you needed to jump from one curve to another. So I highly recommend that. And that leads to this point. When you look at the sort of bowling alley curve that Geoffrey Moore might talk about, it really comes back from Everett Rogers, the diffusion of innovation from decades ago. Actually, the year that I was born. But you've seen this probably where there's the innovators, the early adopters, there's the bowling alley where they lead into the early majority, and then the late majority and the laggards. And typically when we talk about putting together a conference and being the program committee for talks, we want to get the innovators. We want to get them doing keynotes. We want to get them doing the really hot topics. But I want to pose the question, in terms of industry, in terms of community, where are the experts on this graph? Are they the innovators? And I'd love to talk about that more, maybe afterwards. I know we have time constraints. But I don't believe that the innovators are the experts. And I think there's a continuum. And again, you have to look at sort of a multidimensional perspective of where is the learner vis-a-vis the topic and the community. And the experts show up in a lot of different places, but you can pinpoint it. And we do see that. We see that in our sales figures. And I hope to be able to surface more about that. Looking ahead, beyond books, because we have to be moving beyond books. In my opinion, beyond Kindle, I've gone through the experience of actually putting together Moby from Python scripts manually and having to deal with all the different conflicting XML formats. We need to get beyond the notion of EPUBs and Kindle, particularly to be able to do any kind of interactive content that's running code, leveraging cloud, etc. Beyond MOOCs, I believe that the path forward will be leveraging learning paths, continuous learning, inverted classrooms. I didn't talk much, but computational thinking is very much out of Jeanette Wang and all, out of CMU. It's very much the kind of rubric that I try to leverage when I'm teaching. Also learner segmentation and a lot of multidimensional analysis for machine learning of how do you fit the content with the learners. And interestingly, more and more we're hearing that it's not about an individual person learning. It's about their social context. Once they get paid to go to a class, how well do they perform? How does their team perform afterwards? Or maybe you're putting an entire team through a class or sending an entire team to a conference. But it's the team outcome that's ever so more important than an individual's test score. And at the same time, though, we still have to do things like certification. And I've been leading that and trying to understand where do developer certificates fit into this picture, because we have to make it a comprehensive whole. And finally, I'll say that we're very eager to work with new authors on this. This is a greenfield. And what we're doing with notebooks is essentially displacing or helping to evolve what had been done with white papers, what had been done with conference talks, what had been done with MOOCs. And we're inventing this as we go along with everyone else here at this conference. But I believe that Jupyter is having an enormous impact and displacement on these prior modes of media. And going out and talking with early customers, they're extremely eager to do this. Nobody knows exactly what it's going to look like, but we're eager to help invent that future together. And I would invite you to be participants. Please let us know if you're interested. With that, thank you very much. Any questions? Yes?
You mentioned the importance of social context in MOOCs. So I wonder, do you know of anyone trying to cash in on things like Reddit karma, where people go to great lengths to get this imaginary internet?
Yes. That's great. Well, there's the badges. I mean, there's the notion of badges, and certainly better experts in that than me. Cash in. A couple things there that I would like to say. One is, I mean, a lot of people, when they think about MOOCs, the second thought they have is, get a study group together. And that's one thing I've been trying to analyze and really map out is where some of this is coming from. A lot of it's ad hoc, but some of it's becoming more formalized through meetups and things like this. So we're actually looking to try to sponsor or facilitate study groups for difficult topics. I know some of the books that come out of O'Reilly. I know of one in particular. I won't name it, but the examples are so difficult that people have to have a study group just to actually run the code. And so I've seen these thriving study groups as a result. And I think that once you get past the beginner audience, the introductory courses, you get past even some of the intermediate, you get into the advanced topics, it's absolutely crucial. And so the social context really reinforces, I've got to get past this hurdle or I'm blocked and I'll give up. Another one that I guess I would point out, maybe not as much badges, but kind of the gamification. I mean, Keith Devlin and others are really good at this, but Masha Sadova at Salesforce, who does like training for security at Salesforce, has some great talks about this, where the problem that they had, if I can paraphrase it right, is when you're working in enterprise and you're building these ginormous Java projects, a build will take like 60 minutes. So for Salesforce, when an engineer changes some code, goes to commit and run through tests, they've got an hour open. What are they going to do? Are they going to go watch YouTube? Probably, or Reddit or something like that. So what they came up with is, let's have sort of what they were using. Actually, are you familiar with Eggcast? It's a sort of MOOCish kind of platform. I believe Microsoft is very much involved with this too. But Eggcast was one of the platforms they were using, and they basically would structure it so they knew they had that hour window while Maven or whatever was running, and they came up with video-based instruction tied with Git repos. So you'd watch a certain amount of video that would show you how to do best practice in implementing a security feature. They give you an app that runs, but it has security holes. You have a time window to be able to fix that, check it in, pass through tests, and then they have all these leaderboards on different dimensions. So it's totally gamified. So, I mean, rather than go play a video game, they basically give you one. And that's kind of the badge notion. I think it's kind of asymptotically out there. I haven't really had a lot of direct hands-on with the other areas of gamification, but I have had a lot of hands-on with group projects and the peer review. The one that I would point to there, I'm blanking on his name, but I can look it up in the break. There's an instructor out of Australia who did an intro robotics course that was targeted more at third world, Africa, Asia, Southeast Asia. And they had largely, it was based off of peer review. The inverted classroom model was about groups assessing other groups and sharing with them. And there are even Kickstarters for groups in Africa to get the source materials. And so they sort of gamified the peer parts of it. And I thought that was pretty interesting too. I can get, I'm sorry I don't have a link for that, but I can grab that. Question, yes?
Yeah, where does the O'Reilly School of Technology fit in this book?
Certainly, yes. Excellent school. Well, I mean, we have that is a mode of learning, a type of channel, or actually a collection of channels that we have. And it has mentoring aspects, it has video aspects, it has several different aspects. In some ways, it's ahead than maybe some of the other channels we have. I think that mentoring is key. It's just the economics of mentoring have always been kind of problematic. I've participated in various pilots over time, and I would love to be an independent consultant living high on the hog by being a mentor from remote. Just never quite worked out for me. I think that OST is definitely a big part of this picture, because we're seeing that content itself is becoming more and more about training, and training itself is becoming more and more about consulting light. So there's this whole spectrum, or marketing funnel, if you will, where it isn't just about writing a paper anymore. It is much more interactive, and it is much more socially engaging. And I think OST has a very good model for that. Question? Right.
Where for me, one of the only ways to make me actually learn something deeply is that I have to teach somebody else how to learn. So that there's like a whole layered system of people interacting, and it's very large. And so people who have to teach other people then, as an effect, learn and become experts in these parts of technology.
So just to repeat that, that's about software carpentry. There was a spreadsheet that I had a link to that's actually, talking with them, and That was actually some of the examples we were linking to. And really that follows after kind of guild models and initiatory models. And I love that. I'm also involved in something called Data Guild out of Palo Alto, where we had some similar notions of leveraging more of the social dynamics as opposed to VC funding. I do think that peer teaching is really crucial. For what it's worth, my teaching fellowship at Stanford was to set up computer science peer teaching. It's now called residential education, and I think it helped to propagate out to MIT and Dartmouth and others. And I've just seen this really work well. I mean, it's still going 30 years later, oddly enough. How can we leverage that, though, online? And, I do have concerns. I mean, I'm sure you've all seen what's happened at Reddit and other places recently. Quora is another example. So whenever we have something remote, anonymous, we get in these online forums, there's just such enormous gaps for bullying or other types of distortions. I mean, we see it with our 5-star ratings for conference talks. We see atrocious things happening. Last week was actually an extremely unfortunate example of that. So I have to understand what are the mechanisms for social reinforcement for actual beneficial behavior, if you will. But I think software carpentry is awesome. I'm just sort of thinking out loud about that kind of peer relationship at distance. Does that? Question?
Yes, just to follow up on the social carpentry idea. So, is it possible to address the negatives of the anonymous part by actually trying to match up the peers, basically, who's teaching and who's learning? There were some interesting social experiments that were conducted by, for example, matching young people with elderly,
Yeah.
and then trying to get them to talk and
Yeah.
chat and so on, where basically, the older people were getting the company
Yeah.
and they were sharing experience and teaching, the young stuff and so on, and it had very, very positive effects on that.
Yeah.
So is that something that's possible?
Absolutely. I mean, again, very much greenfield. I don't claim to be the expert in this. But I have seen those kinds of programs, and I believe that there is some over Skype. I personally, I participated in some language training, like peer language training over Skype, and it was great. And I look forward to that. I also see that kind of behavior with my kids, interacting with friends online through Skype and Instagram and whatnot. So no, I'm really hopeful that, I mean, a lot of the social channels can be built out. It just, I think that when I see, chat forums like we use for webcasts, for instance, they're fairly flat. We need to be able to make that richer. That's a good one.
I think we're actually blown past our time for the talk, so in the interest of keeping the video length at sort of the same length, we'll go ahead and maybe stop here, but please, I encourage everyone to come down and ask questions to Paco in person. Also congregate outside, remember. Yeah, thank you for
Thank you very
Paco.
much.